I'd like to welcome our audience to episode 6, season 1 of the Wide Open podcast. My name is Bruce Huberman, and my co-host is Paul Asciante, and our executive producer and sound engineer is James Spavelko. This is such a pleasure for me to introduce Jim Cullen to our audience. I've known Jim and his family since my son Morgan attended the Fieldston Lower School. Jim's daughter Nancy and my son were classmates. Jim is an educator, an author of more than 25 books, and just a really smart, nice, and articulate person. His latest book, Bridge and Tunnel Boys, captured my attention as these two musicians, Springsteen and Joel, are two musicians that have played a significant role in our culture over the past 50 years and are still so relevant today. Jim now works at the Greenwich Country Day School after spending most of his academic career at the Ethical Culture Fieldston School in Riverdale. There are so many topics to discuss with Jim. He's been around, so knowledgeable. So we'll get started with basic. So Jim, you grew up in Queens. Your dad was a firefighter. Your mom was a teacher. So tell us about your upbringing, because I think that has a lot to do with your character today and the way you were built as a person. And so let us know how it all started.
Well, it's kind of a familiar story. I think many folks in your audience, I'm sure, can relate. You know, I'm an Attleboro kid. As you mentioned, my dad was a firefighter. My mom was a housewife. They both were from Queens. I think my dad was born in the Bronx. I lived there for the first few years of my life. Moved out to the suburbs, where I grew up in a small town in Northport, New York, in Suffolk County. I was the first kid in my family to go to college. I went to Tufts. I was a student journalist. After I graduated, I sort of freelance wrote for a couple of years, and then I went to graduate school at Brown, where I got a degree in American Studies, and then began a sort of a teaching career. And I taught for a while at Harvard and a couple of other places. But I was part of a two-career academic couple. My wife got a job at Sarah Lawrence. My wife's history teacher was the head of Fieldston, and when she heard we moved down here, she got our son, our oldest son, into the school, and then when an opening happened, I sort of went into my father, my late beloved father-in-law Ted Sazier was an important education reformer, and he was really a big influence on me because he wrote and thought a lot about high school teaching. And so I made that transition, and I've pretty much been there ever since. And it has allowed me to, continue to pursue writing, mostly scholarly writing over the course of the last 20 years. And I'm basically a cultural historian. And in recent years, the last 5-6 years, I've really focused more on I guess you'd say the last quarter of the 20th century. So I did a book on All in the Family. I did a book on Martin Scorsese. I did a book on TV shows that deal with history. I did a book on the year 1980 in American culture. And then I got embarked on this project, Bridge and Tunnel Boys. So that's sort of how I landed where I am these days.
Growing up, were your parents disciplinarians? To write 25 books and to do the schedule you do, raise 4 kids, to me, it's remarkable. And so was there that influence when you were young, or were you just like a mutation? And
well, probably more. Probably a little bit more of a mutation. I didn't grow up in a house with a lot of books in it. Neither of my parents were well educated. They certainly were, intelligent people, and were committed to, giving their 2 kids a better life than they had. My dad loved his work, and that was the message that he always conveyed. Do what you love. Don't worry too much about making money. That'll kind of take care of itself. That was sort of his ethos, and I think I took that to heart in a way that I didn't really wasn't really fully conscious of, but I think that's basically his influence in terms of the way my life turned out, which is like nothing the way that his life turned out. Yeah.
Well, for me, Jim, this is particularly exciting because when Bruce and I started this podcast, our intention was to try to talk to highly successful people, and in the belief that highly successful people in every walk of life have very similar qualities, work ethic, that sort of thing. I'm a professor at Trinity College. My wife, who's 1,000 times brighter than me, is a professor at Trinity College. We've each written 2 books and 25 books. I mean, my God, it's so prolific. But I want to hit you with a hard one right out of the rip here. So how would you define success?
Well, that is a tough one. And there's 2 aspects of that for me. I mean, one is sort of how you define it, and then how you measure it. If once you identify what the criteria are. I mean, in some respects, you could say that I don't really view myself as successful. I didn't, unlike you, I'm the kind of work I do seems most suited for academia, and yet I've never held a regular. I mean, I've taught at a bunch of colleges, but I've never really held a regular academic position. I've written a bunch of books, but they certainly haven't sort of made me rich. So by those metrics, I would say I'm not particularly successful. On the other hand, I guess I'd say 2 things. I mean, one is that the work itself is its own reward, and the fact that I've been able to do it, is important to me. And indeed, a lot of the choices I've made, have been of the kind where I valued autonomy in terms of being able to decide what I wanted to write about, rather than, waiting for the right opportunity to come up or lining up things that, different. There are different ways of going about this, and I took a very specific route, and the route that I took, again, more by instinct than by design, reflected my desire to be able to do things the way that I wanted to do them. So in that regard, I think, I guess that you'd say I have been successful. And of course, as we all know, success is, operates on multiple planes. So, I fortunately I've been gainfully employed for, for much of my life. I've been very lucky in terms of, I've been married for going on 35 years now. I've raised 4 children who I think have done pretty well, or doing pretty well, knock on some wood. So, in that sense, I feel successful as well. I mean, the thing about the word success, though, and one of the issues I think it raises, as I'm sure you're aware, is the issue of agency. Is success something you do? Is success good fortune? And what is the relationship between those 2 things?
Well, you touched on something earlier that sort of struck me. You've always done something that you're passionate about. And, the saying Confucius says, he who loves what he does can never find work. And so in that regard, you've been highly successful. We did a podcast early on with Michael Gervais, and we were talking about how do you measure success? What do you consider success? And clearly your priorities have been balanced and family and work. And by the way, I was born in the Bronx and my father was a shoemaker. And so we have very similar sort of backgrounds. Yeah. And but it is beautiful that you've been able to do something that is your purpose. And how cool is that?
Well, you live a day to day. You don't necessarily. I mean, maybe you should. Count your blessings, and I try to do that. But you're usually worried about this picture you can't track down, or this contract you're waiting to come through, or whatever. I mean, there's all that kind of stuff. But you've done this now a half a dozen times. I mean, and you obviously you went into it with some ideas, or at least some questions. I mean, what do you feel like you've made any discoveries when you talk to people from very, very different walks of life here in terms of how they're talking about this stuff?
Well, I'll speak first here. One of the things that we've found with every one of them is a deep sense of humility and a deep sense of purpose. We didn't have a lot of narcissistic, look at me, I'm really special. That's been very gratifying. But I think in every case, there was a sense of purpose and a hunger to master. Nobody was sitting around on their hands. All of the people we've spoken to were still driven, still focused, still vital. And you're still pumping out books. How vital can that be?
We'll see how much longer. But yeah.
So I'm really curious about your process. I mean, you teach during the day, you come home, you have family, you have other, responsibilities. So in terms of writing, like, when do you write? I mean, it's got to be like, and you crank it out. I mean, you've written a lot. And so how does that work? Do you get up early in the morning before the day is start and you write, or is it a nighttime, process? How does that work for you?
Well, I'm not what I mean. Especially fiction writers, I think, are very much in that early in the morning kind of thing. I know one or two myself that have worked that way. But no, for me, it's I mean, the short answer to your question is it's sort of a nights and weekends thing. I mean, I am a creature of habit. I get up, I go to work, I come home. There's everything from feeding the dog to taking out the trash and all that kind of stuff. But you try to have a hard stop, around 7 o'clock, and you put in a couple hours, and you slow but steady, you chip away. My kids are older now, so it's a little bit easier. I do have more time on the weekend, and of course, for me as a high school teacher, summers are a big stretch, a big open stretch for things. I have a few 2-week vacations over the course of the year, December and March. And these are big slabs of time to get stuff done. The thing that I think, I mean, I mentioned in passing that I was a student journalist in high school and college. And I think that was, even though I was not cut out to be a journalist in any number of ways, but it did really teach me, I think, or it got me habituated to, just knocking prose out. I've never suffered from writer's block. I just have a very sort of task orientation. I don't know that my prose is especially poetic, but I'm able to just steadily churn out a body of material relatively quickly.
That's huge, because most people in this day and age can't sit down and write the way you write, and so it's just the process that you have has really worked, and you know how to craft. And so do you start out like this new book, which I thought was very interesting, and it really captured my attention, because both of these guys, Springsteen and Billy Joel, are still so relevant. So what about these guys that really lights the fire under you to get out there and sort of open up and see how their relevance was obtained, and then how they continue to knock it out? I know this past few days, Billy Joel's been playing with Sting, I think somewhere out in the Midwest, and they keep reinventing themselves, and they still are so relevant, which there's so many things to discuss about that, because this day and age, I wonder if the musicians who are now coming into their own are going to be around in 25 years. And it seems like these musicians, the Stones, the Beatles are, obviously have some missing players, but in terms of, all these artists that we grew up with in the 60s and the 70s into the 80s are still really relevant. And I don't think that, I don't see that now. Do you sort of have an opinion on that? Or do you think, in 25 years, the musicians that are just starting out now are going to be as relevant as the Springsteens, the Joels, the Stones, and the list goes on and on and on? So I was just really wondering how you felt about that.
I'll start at the end and then go backward. I mean, this, in a short declarative sentence, I think I can say that, 50 years from now, I do think that people are going to be talking about Taylor Swift and with the same degree of affection and admiration that they do for these people. So I think that will happen. But, people's careers or the success that the people like that have are not just a function of their talent or not just a function of their luck, but also a function of the circumstances and the structure of opportunity at the time in which they're alive. I mean, I'll swing back to myself for a second, because one of the things I didn't say, which maybe is worth noting, is that I write all my books in the last decade or so have been written at Starbucks, and partly because as you've indicated in passing, writing can be isolating work, and so having some company around, and I'm as distracted as everybody else. But the reason why I bring it up in this context is that it's possible for me to do that. It's possible for me to be a high school teacher even that does this, because I've got stuff like the internet, and I don't necessarily have to go to the archives to find Thomas Jefferson's letter to his nephew from 1785. It's a few keystrokes away. So my ability to do that is not just a function of my work ethic or being my mother's son. It's also what's there. And I think this is very relevant for talking about Billy Joel and Bruce Springsteen, because they happen to come of age and at the midpoint of the 20th century. And first of all, that was a time of tremendous prosperity and upward mobility, and both of these guys, we can get into the details of this if you like, came out of experiences of downward mobility. In the generation before they were born, they actually their families sort of lost ground, but they're coming of age in post-war greater New York, and so there's this sense of a rising tide lifting all boats. But they're also coming of age, at a time when popular music is assuming as the shape that it is. And again, there's a bunch of things going on there. There's the technology of cheap electric guitars and keyboards and recording equipment and so on. There's teenagers with disposable income that are able to spend money on this stuff. I mean, and so on and so forth. So, as I always say, if Bruce Springsteen had been born, 25, 30 years earlier, he would have been a short story writer, not a rock musician. If Billy Joel had been born a little earlier, he would have been a Broadway composer, not sort of a rock musician. So their youths coincided at a particular time when this musical idiom was quite popular. And you could, a guy like both of these guys could actually, with a relatively minimal investment, churn out stuff in their garages and actually make some money, at school dances, and then be part of a circuit. I mean, there's a commercial infrastructure that's in place that can sort of sustain them, and that allows them to get a start. But on the other hand, the platforms that they're on are relatively finite. I mean, it's like TV. There was only a few TV stations: CBS, ABC, NBC. There's only a few record labels, but they were good enough that they could manage with some difficulty to get aboard that, and then could sort of literally and figuratively be broadcast to the world. Here in the 21st century, you can make an album on a machine of the kind that I'm talking to you right now, right? I mean, so it's very, very easy. But on the other hand, the distribution difficulty is, in theory, the internet is wonderful. You can reach anybody at a moment's notice, but it's a gnarly thicket that it's impossible to sort of cut through. So anyway, I don't want to go on and on here. I'll give you a chance to sort of hone me a little bit, but that's sort of my answer to your question, that they were products of history that allowed them to be who they were at the moment they were, or allowed their talent and allowed their good fortune to really snap into focus.
Well, it's clear that they both are passionate about their craft, and they've constantly redefined themselves, as all great performers do over time. As a U.S. coach, and having had the opportunity to coach world team tennis and be around, Monica Seles and people like that, It's interesting. I wonder what that you said that in 40 years' time we'd be talking about Taylor, because they now with the social media can hit it so hard, so fast, and they can make so much money so quickly that I wonder about their staying power. You know, I grew up and I idolized Rod Laver, and Rod played for a very long time. Then I watched McEnroe come in, and now, you know, you'll see someone hit the top fast, but they don't stay. Now, maybe it's because the competition is greater, but I wonder if the hunger can stay alive, if the flame can stay alive when there's so much coming at them so early and so quickly. And we're not seeing a lot of, you know, maybe in music we will, you know, Travis Scott, you know, and I was at Madison Square Garden with my daughter the other day, and she was watching Travis Scott, and I saw John McEnroe coming down the street, and John was going to see Travis because they have a deal where they're working together. But it's all happening so fast, and I don't know about the staying power. I hope I'm wrong.
Well, you know, we certainly live in a time of limited attention spans, and I'm not sure that exactly translates to what you're saying, but that may be part of it, especially because there's such a velocity of other stuff coming at them in terms of promotion or you know, other kinds of media stuff that they can do. I do think that you know, to return to your earlier point, you know, that passion is important. You know, I mean, both of these guys, Billy Joel and Bruce Springsteen, decided when they were in high school that there was nothing else for them. They, you know, they had no. I mean, Billy Joel didn't even finish high school. Springsteen did, but you know, he was making enough money to live on, you know, by the time he finished high school, and there was just never any question of doing anything else. And I think that, you know, if you really truly believe that, you know, then you know, there's a kind of a point of no return, and I think that was really very important in both of their cases. You know, I do believe, I mean, that there are still people like that out there today. It may be harder in a realm in professional sports or in tennis in particular, you know, and we know that there are certain fields where people peak young, you know.
Sure.
So that's all sort of part of the story. But I think that I think that an intensity of desire remains the single most important factor, you know, and that it will allow some, maybe not as many, people to persist, you know, in this way.
I was very fortunate in that I met a person a little later in life, but who had just an astounding impact on me, and that was Tom Wolfe. Tom was just the man, and his son played squash at Trinity and went to Riverdale, and we worked it out so that when Tommy got his degree, Tom was the keynote speaker at graduation. They exchanged diplomas and all of that. But it was always amazing to me. I wrote my second book only because of Tom Wolfe. He called me and he said, "Coach, it's time to write a book." And I said, "No, Tom, that's not what I do." And he said, "No, you have a story to tell and you're going to write a book and I'm going to make it happen." And the first thing he did was he got me an agent. And do you have an agent with all of those different books? It must be circuitous.
I have had agents, you know, and I have one now, but you know, this goes back to what I was saying earlier. You know, in the end, and this was not really a principled decision I made. It was something that sort of happened, and was and ultimately in retrospect was kind of a obvious or an inevitable reflection. I was much more interested in just being able to get the stuff out there and find someone who would take it, you know, then work through an agent and a process that would inevitably be slower and maybe in some cases better, no doubt in some cases be better, you know. that has not been a big part of my story. And, in a way, I will say, or should say, that I regret that, because, an agent, and I know an agent has gotten things for me that I couldn't get for myself. An agent would be another pair of eyes that would make my work better. But I made my choices, and and I don't fundamentally regret them that way. Yeah.
Well, funny story, when Tom, I got a phone. I was coaching the tennis team, and my phone rang, and a man on the other line said, just as to show you how little I know about what I'm doing, and a man said, "Coach," I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm calling. My name is David Black, and I want to be your agent." And I said, "Oh, well, why should you be my agent?" And he said, "That's a very good question. I'm the agent of Mitch Albom, Tuesdays with Maury, and Dan Brown, the Da Vinci Code." I said, "Oh, I think you can be my agent." I had no idea what I was doing.
Yeah. Tom Wolfe is an interesting figure in this regard, because, of course, he was an immensely talented man, but he also was somebody who had a clear vision about what he wanted to do. It wasn't simply that he wanted to write a lot of books; it's that he wanted to redefine, a mode of expression. And that's really his legacy. It's not just that he wrote this really good book or that really good book. It's that he bequeathed a notion of what writing can be. Journalistic writing and fiction. Yeah.
So we still are very close to his wife, Aunt Sheila. And when we went out to visit her this summer, she made the comment to us that really struck me. She said, "Tom was not of this world." And he really, he never had a drink. He was always all in white. And, he was a caricature in a way, but he was so incredibly interesting. And yeah, I think you're right. He knew what he wanted his business card to be, if you will, and his business card was all white, and his business card was the manner in which he wrote, and he was a beautiful man.
You're lucky to have known him. Yeah.
Yeah.
This episode of the Wide Open Podcast is sponsored by Maurice Garment Care. Established in 1961, Maurice has set the standard for full-service dry cleaning, home, interior, and wardrobe restoration. Their reputation for wedding gown restoration is second to none. They have pickup and delivery service throughout New York City, Brooklyn, Long Island, including the Hamptons. They also have a shipping service that will send garments throughout the United States. They can be found at www.maurice.newyorkcity. That's Maurice, Meurice, and can be reached at 718-328-0313. So in terms of switching gears a little bit, you've been an educator for a really long time. And my vision of education is not your vision. And so it seems to have changed so much with the internet, social media. So is this sustainable? Or do you think, how would you be almost like an architect of education over the next, 10 to 20 years? Because to me, the kids today may not be educated maybe the way they should be. And there's a lot of distractions. And now even with AI, it seems like if a kid really knows what he's doing, really doesn't have to learn anything. I mean, he has got AI to help him get through write the papers and do this and do that. So I think you're the person to tell us where education has been and where it is today, and what do you think the future is for education, high school, college, and I'll give you the form here.
Well, there's a lot to take on there. I mean, I think that maybe the first thing to say in terms of evaluating my perspective on this, is that I'm a historian. So, I tend to think in terms of previous parallels or analogies, and I do think that there is something very profound about all of this that it's going to take a while to sort of process. I don't really know what it all means, but I do. I mean, I do know. Well, first, I mean, I know, like, you want to take the really big picture. That, well, I mean, I'm a historian of the media. I've written a number of books about this. You see that people have all kinds of freighted, fraught, and in many cases overblown notions about what this new thing is going to be. I mean, D.W. Griffith thought that film was going to bring about world peace because if people could really see what war does, they would never actually do it, or that the advent of broadcast radio will shatter our notions of distance and reshape, our consciousness, or that television is rotting children's brains and short-circuiting things. And, the great Neil Postman, who wrote the classic book Amusing Ourselves to Death, I mean, this notion of shortened attention spans was not invented by the iPhone in 2007, so we've been here before, and I'm not sure anything even now, is as profound as what the printing press did, in terms of the dissemination of knowledge, I mean, among other things, resulting in, murderous wars over the meaning of the Bible that people could sort of decide to consult for themselves, So, I hesitate to think that this is really something new under the sun. I do think that it's very dramatic. And I just a moment ago used an illustration of my own life in terms of what it has empowered me to do that I otherwise wouldn't be able to do. But anyway, to try to really provide a more direct answer to your question, I see myself in the judgment business, and what I mean by that is I'm not exactly that I go around judging people or want to teach people to go around judging people, but ultimately, what I hope to foster as a coach, and I think the athletic model really is relevant here. I try to coach kids, to how to sort, evaluate, use, assess information. It's very easy to get information. It's very hard to decide how credible, how useful, how relevant that information actually is. What criteria do we use to decide whether something is trustworthy? What do we mean when we use words like successful or good? How can we craft questions that are usefully answerable if we get the right information? One of the things I say to my kids all the time is that, life is an existential state of insufficient information. If you knew everything you wanted to know or needed to know, there would be no need to make any decisions. Everything would be obvious, and we'd all be living like Wall Street bankers, But we have to make decisions based on incomplete information. People we don't know very well, outcomes that are unforeseeable. Forks in the and so on. So that's where I really see my job, and I do think as a media person and as a popular culture person, which I am, I try to work a lot within the framework where these kids are coming from. You can evaluate the trustworthiness of Sophocles, and you should, but you can also assess the trustworthiness of Olivia Rodrigo. And why she's saying what she's saying, or what she means by what she's saying, or how we compare what she's saying to what this other person is saying, and so on.
I'd like to come in on something here, and I'd be very interested because you work in an environment where I see this being particularly peaked. Last week I actually had the honor of speaking at the Brunswick School, and I spoke to the students, and then I spoke to the parents. And what I'm seeing as a college professor is that these young people are coming to us now, and they look more put together than they've ever looked before. But the first time they face adversity, they fall into a million pieces like a porcelain doll because they haven't been allowed to fail. And in the name of love, we will do anything to make sure Susie and Johnny have a smooth journey, but it's the bumpy journey that's going to guarantee the success of their lives. So as an educator, where do you see your influence in this sort of thing? As a college coach, I drive to work and there are helicopters flying all over this building with parents just making sure that this journey is smooth and uncomplicated. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting to think about this question talking to a coach, because one of the things I'm very aware of, and I go to a school like Brunswick that I sort of regard as sports crazy. I mean, these kids, it's really what they live for,
Yeah.
And in a way, it's not hard. There's a way in which being a coach is easier than being a teacher, in the sense that the people you're dealing with want to be there, and they,
right.
And so I really, I said a minute ago that I'm in the judgments business, but one of the biggest challenges I have is what I'll call sort of the incentive business. I mean, my job is to try to get people to do things they otherwise would not do.
Sure.
Whether they wouldn't do it because they don't wanna, or they don't do it because they don't know how, or because they don't do it because they haven't gotten guidance, and so I'm always having to think about how I can structure an experience, like, how am I going to set up an essay assignment that they'll have to do the reading in order to write, or how can I ask a question that will, I hate to use this word, but sort of force them to do this thing, and what's tricky about this is that, and I just was talking about my wife about this. I mean, you almost, if you're not careful, you sort of get into a cat and mouse kind of situation where you're constantly trying to sort of close off exits, and channel them in this particular direction, and that can take on a life of its own, and you don't, and then it becomes a kind of power struggle, and that's a terrible thing,
Sure.
But you have to, but if you can get to a place where you do structure these things, and there is a clear set of incentives, then you have to also step back when they're not met, and say, you didn't do it. You didn't meet the bar, or this outcome was a predictable consequence of the choices I watched you make in real time.
Right.
And you have to say that without malice, or you have to say that without shaking a finger. You just have to let the chips fall where they may, and let that educative process unfold.
Right.
And obviously it's not necessarily entirely a passive thing, and this is one of those things that mom and dad are good for. When they come home and they say, I don't know what to do or whatever. But I think that's sort of what you have to do to address the problem that you're raising here.
Well, to double click on what you just said, because it's beautiful. My wife's a professor here, and you get 3 hours a week with these kids. I could get 48 hours on a weekend. So we have the gift of time. Mm-hmm. And, I recently spoke to a professor here, and he said, I'm really jealous of the relationship you have with your players, because, you get so much time with them. And he said, if we did role reversal, what would you do? How would you teach my class? And I said the first day I would take them miniature golfing. I'd get out of the classroom so we could get to know each other. But what you said, I really want to mention, because for the athletic piece, yes, they're there because they want to be there. But on the parental side, very often they're in that athletic venue because it's going to open doors for them down the road. And it's an ROI situation, which is devastating to the development of young people. And I see that all the time.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, that I think there's this tragically misguided idea that that's the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily have to worry about passing organic chemistry as long as I play well enough, or kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And what's hard about that is that it's not so much that it's not entirely wrong, but that you don't necessarily want to squash that love of the game, or that or that intensity. You don't want to and you don't want to extinguish things prematurely. So it's very tricky, right? I mean,
Sure.
it's not just simply a matter of saying, kid, it's you'll be lucky to do Division III here.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
kind of a thing.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Moving on to just something else that I
Yeah.
think you could maybe sort of help me understand. So obviously, I don't want to get into real politics or anything like that, but in general, we have a two-party system, and it seems to hit a time where it's really not effective anymore. It's been very political, and rather than governing, this country. So do you think this is sustainable, this two-party system? Because I mean, the gridlock is incredible, from both sides. I'm right down the middle. But so what do you think, as an historian and someone who's really studied? Do you think it's sustainable? I mean, it seems to me that it is really in a ravine, and I don't know what the answers are to get it out and back onto the road and benefit, society. So, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I guess I sort of have to, for a number of reasons, and again, I will, resort to my default setting here and talk historically. I want to remind myself, as I look at a landscape from the angle that you're describing, and which I share, is that, Alexander Hamilton really truly believed that Thomas Jefferson was going to take this country off a cliff in 1800. The guy was just, in his crazy notions about democracy and his arid abstractions. I mean, and the sort of ridiculous, pandering, the country was not going to survive. I mean, he really, and he was not alone. He really believed that. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams had a very rocky career. They, again, with each other. I mean, their relationship. They were friends. They were enemies. They were friends again. If there was one thing they agreed on at the end of their lives, it was this Andrew Jackson guy is a problem. He's going to be, he is going to be a dictator. And so on. We had a civil war. We went through something that's far worse than we're experiencing now. So in that sense, I don't take a lot of this stuff too seriously. Craven politicians, opportunists, populists, all this stuff. And I actually do believe, that at the end of the day, more often than not, the judgment of the people is probably relatively sound and probably more sound than the experts who have always, wanted to call the shots in one way or another. So in all that sense, I'm sort of I'm a skeptic, and I guess you might say I'm an optimist, and so on. All that said, I'm also aware, and this is not so much a matter of, this president versus that president, or this ideology versus that ideology, that, nations, like all living things, are mortal. They don't last forever, and they deteriorate. And they deteriorate in sort of predictable ways. This notion of impeaching, this is how the Roman Republic went down. Julius Caesar did what he did because if he didn't do what he did, he was going to get thrown in jail because he was going to get prosecuted. There are some patterns here that way. And so. I don't know exactly how or when this will happen, but I kind of do think that we're not on a good trajectory, and I'm not sure there's anything we can do about it except try to honor, to keep the faith, because the things that we have done are not always going to be successful for everyone forever, but they have done a lot of good for a long time, what I mean by that is, you know, Japan, China, have seen good and bad, thick and thin. They've been powerful, they've been less powerful, but their civilizations, their ways of life, their cultural commitments, have been in some respect remained relatively steadily. I mean, we don't live by a Confucian order, but they have for a couple thousand years, and I think that's probably kind of worked. I mean, so I guess what I'm saying is you dance with the gal who brung you, and so I'm hoping that our way forward will ultimately be a matter of fidelity to what made us great. As Bill Clinton once said in one of his wiser moments, he had many different ones, that there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed with what's right with America. I really believe that. I really believe that's true.
Jim, I'm very attracted to your way of thinking. It really resonates with me to listen to you talk. You speak a lot like my dear old dad did, who was my best friend in life. And his philosophy was balance, order, but also chill out, so take a deep breath, let this thing flow a little bit. We particularly with where we are, we're so reactive. Everything is, snapshots and boom. And listening to you, it feels like let's walk down this road a little longer. Let's see what we're really talking about. And I find that very comforting. Do you feel like you look at life a lot differently now than you did maybe 30 years ago? It's very much the Mark Twain quote, when I was 15, I thought my father was a fool. And when I was 30, I couldn't believe how much he learned in 15 years. Do you look at life very differently now?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm hoping to, and I'm hoping that this, insofar as you heard the optimism from me, that it is kind of a hard-won optimism. I do also think that this is a good opportunity for me to connect what we've been talking about to the reason why I'm presumably here, and I think to some degree this is something I learned from Bruce Springsteen. That Springsteen came of, as we talked about earlier in this conversation, he came of age at a very particular time, a very fortuitous time, for him and the country at large. And as we all know, Springsteen has been fiercely committed to pointing out the nation's shortcomings as he's seen them, and he's done it his whole career. But ultimately, what he's really about, I think, is affirming what's best about the country that made him, and finding ways to affirm it. And even his criticism of the country is rooted in that deep love and deep sense of attachment. His career, has been about, valorizing the white working class from which he sprang. He has, imaginatively, projected the lives of this gallery of people and sustained it for sort of half a century. And that sense of love and loyalty and patriotism, is something that I think is really quite profound, and something I think I and others have sort of learned from him.
That's beautiful. So since it's all about me, Jim, as I go through life, how well do you know these guys? Can you get me tickets to see Billy Joel?
I know. It's funny. I never met either of them, and this isn't a good vehicle for me to explain how this particular book came about, because I had 25 years ago, I published a book. Actually, it was with HarperCollins. It was it was a big deal at the time, called Born in the USA. And actually, I'll just mention this. It's coming out in a third edition in a couple
Whoa. Good for you.
So I really worked pretty hard on updating it, and revising it, and so on. But anyway, I wrote this book, and it was an exciting time for me. And after I wrote it, I thought maybe I should write a book about Billy Joel. And so I wrote a letter to Billy Joel, and I got back a letter from him, and he said basically, I'm not, I'm actually thinking about writing a book myself, or making clear that that's sort of not an option. And I actually, at that point in my life, did not want to become the Springsteen guy or the pop music guy. I've gone on to write about a lot of other things, and only in the last few years have I sort of returned back to this subject. But as part of that, I've done a bunch of books with Rutgers University. They have a press. They do a lot of cultural history, and there was a guy there who, I pitched a book to him that he turned down. He said, I can't take this book because my bailiwick, my area is regional stuff. I can only publish books that have to do with Greater New York, the Greater New York area. So I was actually, and in fact, I'm actually finishing a book. This is a long story, but I'm actually finishing a book about New Jersey, which is kind of a strange thing. But at one point, a couple of days after that conversation, I suddenly realized that Billy Joel and Bruce Springsteen, one grew up east of the city, the other grew up west of the city. I mean, it's a perfect paradigm for this guy's territory, and he agreed, and this thing came together. I mean, from beginning to end, I think it took me 6 months to write it. I mean, it was just sort of right there, so. And of course, that's a lot of, you were asking me earlier about like how I do it and why so many and so on. So much of it for me is framing a project that I think I can execute. And this is something I felt intuitively, instantly, that I could do, and I could do quickly. And so that's sort of how this all came about. Again, Springsteen had been someone that I had been living with, actively thinking about. Billy Joel, by contrast, and Bruce was saying earlier at one point in our exchanges that that he had missed the first round of this, that he was never a big Bruce Springsteen fan growing up in Jersey, kind of thing. And the parallel for me is, I grew up with Billy Joel in the background. I grew up on Long Island. He was always there. I didn't dislike him, but I didn't really think of him as, he wasn't, he wasn't an obsession for me. So circling back around to him, was actually quite an interesting experience. And, we haven't talked too much about him here. And, he is an extraordinarily gifted man, a more troubled man than I think Springsteen is. I don't think he has the capaciousness that Springsteen does. But one of the things that really became very clear to me working on this project in a way that I didn't really appreciate before is just what an unbelievable musician he is, and how Springsteen has said that Billy Joel's songs are built like the Rock of Gibraltar. Like he, unlike Springsteen, Joel had a classical training, and he just does these. We'll throw in a Beethoven thing there or a Tchaikovsky thing there. You don't notice it. You don't even know it, but it's what gives this seemingly catchy, simple piece of music, this layer of complexity that just allows it to ping in a way that you're not conscious of, but which is sort of unmistakable. He's an unbelievable mimic. I mean, he can tap, just about anyone or anything. He does a mean version of Born to Run. That's sort of hilariously perfect.
Well, it's interesting you say all of that, because I think the two groups, or the two that I've always been so attracted to, were Simon and Garfunkel, and the other was Billy Joel. And it was because they both were so human in their music. There was pain and pathos, Piano Man, and, but there was also that New York vibe, we're going to sit on the Long Island Distressway and listen to Billy Joel, bottle of, red. And so I to listen to you talk about him just blows my mind.
Well, it's funny. There's probably a pretty good book comparing Paul Simon and Billy Joel. I mean, two queens, whatever, two outer guys, again, extraordinarily versatile. A little bit prickly, both of them. Actually, I taught a course at Fieldston for many years with the head of the music department, and it was called LP 12 Albums That Changed the World. And one of the albums we did was Graceland, and Paul Simon's son was in our class, and he brought in Paul Simon, which of course was a great.
It was very cool.
But he was also, he was also like very clear very quickly. This was not a man who suffered fools gladly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Wow.
Something I would be remiss if I didn't bring up, my daughter Max, who
Yes.
took your class called Hamilton when she was in high school at Fieldston. And I think that will stay with her, forever. So and that was like a semester class. And are you doing something now? Because I don't know what other topic could be, have the legs for a semester. Are you working on something new? Because that was very innovative back then, I thought, and it was so well received. The kids, not everyone could take the class because the demand was so high. So are you working on something like sort of with the similar type of, vibe or,
in one sense, no. I mean, that was just such a great sort of set of, and that was such a Fieldston thing too. Up until that point, my favorite play of all time was Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson, which was this great, sort of musical about Andrew Jackson, and a Fieldston parent, had gotten a block of tickets for this play at the Public Theater that I had never heard of, and there were a few extra tickets, and did I want to go, for free, and so I tagged along on this thing, and I was sort of utterly blown away by it, and it's there was something very fortuitous about that, because it's one thing to say, hey, we could teach a course around this, but there were three discrete pieces that like interlocked so beautifully. One was the cast album. The second was Ron Chernow's book, on which the play was based, but it really worked as a text. And then there was a great edition of Hamilton's writing. So it almost was like a recipe that wrote itself. So it was very easy to put together a course that with those three pieces. And I taught the class twice. I think Max took it the first time. And I think I taught her on more than one occasion. I'm just so fond of her. She has such a wonderful way. But so I've never been able to do anything quite like that. But I do develop a lot of courses. I mean, right now, I'm in the middle of teaching a new course called Money, Morals, and Mobility in a Modernizing Age, and we're using Hernan Diaz's new Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Trust, which is a novel told sort of from multiple points of view. So we're doing that, and A Raisin in the Sun, and then How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia. And of course these are kids in Greenwich, Connecticut. They're the children of traders. So it's I was not joking with my colleagues. When I said that in order to get a new class that'll attract sufficient enrollments, I had to get the word money in the title. So that's so I do a lot of team teaching. I do a lot of interdisciplinary teaching, and that's really the real source of joy for me these days, in terms of trying to engineer these kinds of experiences for kids.
No, it's just beautiful. You're doing such creative things, and I want to thank you for your time tonight. I found it really just deep and inspirational, and hopefully we can meet each other someday.
I'd like that. It sounds like you're maybe in the neighborhood. Of course, it's a very easy thing and almost self-indulgent to talk with you about my work this way. I appreciate your kindness here, and I'm glad that you have launched this venture, and that you've got a panoply of voices that you're channeling here, and I hope this experiment continues to yield results for you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jim.
I could not be more. It's funny when we finish these recordings, I'm just so uplifted, and you really and we just it was like the tip of the iceberg, because there's so many topics that we could expound on, and you're a wealth of knowledge. And I think, our audience is really, learn something. And so I just want to thank you again. It was such a pleasure. And I know you're going to continue to do what you do, and it's great because you're ahead of the curve and you think out of the box, and you know, the fruits of your labor have really come to the forefront. So thank you so much for your time. And I don't know, Paul, if you want to just wrap it up and or have anything else to say.
Well, no, I mean, you know, anybody that I think every person would say, I'd like my child to be in your class. And I don't think there can be any greater compliment than that.
I think you're right. Thank you.
Yeah. So we'll let you go. We'll
Okay.
keep you posted. Thank you again, and have a pleasant evening. And
please convey my abiding affection for Max, you know, and Morgan as well. Yeah.
Well, they feel the same way about you. So I just want to let you know that you know, when they look back on their, you know, high school days, you're at the forefront. So be well, be safe, enjoy your family, and we'll speak soon and we'll keep you posted.
All righty. All right.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you
All right,
so much.
You got it.
Thank you for listening to the Wide Open Podcast, a Zoa Soundworks production, hosted by Paul Asiante and Bruce Huberman as themselves. The show is produced and engineered by James Babalco. Theme song and incidental music created by Zoa Soundworks, LLC, in collaboration with Marco Guarino. Have a question, suggestion, or just want to say hello? Send us an email through our contact page at zoasoundworks.com. That's ZOASOUNDWORKS. It may be featured in a future episode. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe to the Wide Open Podcast. We upload a new episode every month. Look for us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you find your podcasts.